I'm Darcy Bakkegaard, and today's weekly web chat is all about project-based learning and how to actually facilitate and manage those projects once you have them up and running. And to tell us and give us some tips about how to do it, I have Liberty Middle School science teacher.
Actually, CTE right now.
Oh, wow, that's even better. So like all kinds of projects, Andrea Thiner. And so tell us a little bit about what you teach. What does the CTE involve for you?
The CTE that I teach right now is pre-engineering classes. So it's Gateway to Technology for 6th grade and 8th grade, and then computer applications for 7th grade. So basically teaching them how to use all the applications on the computer, mostly Microsoft Office products, but being able to use those in a real world setting.
And that sounds, we have not, like in all the conversations that we've had leading up to this, we had not talked about that. But the nature of those classes just sound like something that lend themselves really well to project-based learning as a style. Correct. Of the students experiencing those things. So is that your main, is that like what, how would you describe your classroom in general?
Well, so my 7th grade class, my 7th grade computer applications class, I've actually turned it into, it's a quarter class, and I basically turned the entire quarter into a project. So the students come in and we kind of get them introduced to what the course is, and then they actually take off with coming up with a business or a service that they create, and their end product is that they actually present a business plan. They use Word, and they use PowerPoint to create a presentation that they give to a board, and then they also use Publisher to create business cards that they actually bring in, and then they also incorporate Excel into that because they have to put it both into their PowerPoints and into their business plans.
So it's so many layers because it's like taking them through this project-based learning. And last week we did talk about the difference between projects in classes, but what's the end project-based learning? And it sounds like you have like all of these layers. So they're doing their 4 C's. They're doing a lot of authentic application of things. They're learning their tech skills. And they're doing all of that through this project-based learning experience. Just for that reclarification, or for you, how do you view project-based learning similarly or different from projects in a classroom?
So one of the biggest things is I always say that project-based learning is the vehicle that you're using to do the teaching rather than doing the teaching and then doing a project.
Okay.
So if you think about project-based learning as it's the framing for the entire learning experience. So using that driving question to be, this is what you have to be able to do at the end, and start that at the very beginning, and then the kids go, whoa, because they don't know what to do to get there. So you freak them out, which is great. And then you build them up and scaffold all the way through until they get to the end product. And then at the end, they're like, oh, that wasn't so hard. Right. And that's the whole point.
Because they went through and they learned how to answer that question.
Right.
Right. But I could see why at the very beginning, it's going to feel like, well, I can't possibly answer that.
Right. It's super overwhelming, and it makes them like, and I asked the kids today when I actually was introducing a piece today in my 7th grade class, and I said, who feels overwhelmed? And like 3/4 of the kids' hands went up, and I went, okay, good. And they all just looked at me like, what?
How is that a good thing?
And I said, trust me. And so we went through, started talking about stuff, and I said, they're like, but this is really big. I'm like, yeah, it is.
It is. And you can handle it.
And you'll be just fine. And they're like, okay. And like you could watch them go through like, okay, I'm going to do this. And so it was really cool. And this one kid goes,
right, just in one class period.
Right.
Of just thinking about the project. That's really cool.
And one kid turns and looks at me today and he goes, so we're really going to do this? And I said, yeah. And he goes, we're really going to make this business? And I said, yeah. And he goes, that's awesome. And I'm like, that's perfect. Like, that's exactly what we want.
That is what we want. Well, and that goes to a lot of the things that we have talked about as we go like to the slide deck. The slide deck, as always, the resources are in the video link, but just because of what you said, that's this of like, it's real life, and having that kid go, we're really going to do this. What a powerful experience for those kids of like having that. So we talked about all of these great things to remember about essential project design. You know, we're also going to share as we go through, because of your science background, we are going to visit a little bit about some of the different project-based learning experiences that you've created in your science classrooms. But we also want to spend most of our time today talking about the existence, living in the project. And this just happened to be an email that I received yesterday from AJ Giuliani, who's one of the co-authors of the Design Thinking book Launch, along with John Spencer. And he does a lot of project-based learning work.
Yep.
Later in the slide deck, there's a resource for some online project-based training. It's through AJ Giuliani and John Spencer that you can take an online class.
Yep.
And the biggest thing, like I read this and I went, yes, that is what it feels like. Of you get into the project and you've done all this front work. Amy and I last week talked about how much front work setting up a project really takes, of thinking through and trying to anticipate the students' needs, anticipate how to facilitate, anticipate what mini lessons they're going to need, but not knowing exactly when, and like letting that evolve. And then this, how can I talk to every kid and every group? How can I manage all of these different projects happening? Like all of these kids are going in different directions. How can I possibly manage all of these, the businesses that you talked about? If there are these teams of kids doing all these different businesses, how can I manage all of the different elements and all of these different things? And I love the way and then it hits, pure panic. And I don't like this quote for the fact that we as teachers feel that way. I'm not trying to say like, yay, like panic time, that's the peak performance time as a teacher. I'm not saying that. I'm sharing this because that's just the reality. And
yes.
So if you are reaching that point in a project, you're not alone. Like it's going to be messy. And we were talking before we started about feeling like a project sucks and it's really bad. And like I'm asking you to repeat yourself for the purposes of this, but I really enjoyed what you said about that because I have felt that way dozens of times of like you're teaching something and then you're like, well, I just sucked, or man, that like didn't go the way I thought it would. That was awful.
I tell teachers all the time, the first time you do a project, you will feel like, oh my God, that was the worst thing I've ever done. That sucked. And you're in the middle of it and you're like, what do I do? Mm-hmm. And the reality is, one of the things we mentioned, we were talking about before, was that the kids have no idea.
Yeah.
First of all, the kids have no clue that it sucked. And you know, the funny part is it might have sucked, but they don't know. And you go, oh, well, I'm going to do that differently.
Right.
Oh, well, that I really liked. And then I look at this other part and I go, oh, now I see why that didn't go the way I thought it was going to.
I need to do a step here in order to make that work better.
And every time you do a project, you learn, even if you do different or you change it, you always learn from that project what the kids need. And then every group of kids is different. So you have to be able to adjust on the fly.
That's true.
You can't expect to be teaching the exact same thing all the time. You have to be able to say, okay, yep, it sucked this time, and then this other time it went really well. So being able to go, oh, I have to do that reflection always. So we force our kids and want our kids to do that reflection as teachers. I mean, something we have to learn how to do from the very beginning of teaching, but when we're doing a project, we really have to learn how to reflect. And so that part of it, even though it sucks, it really didn't. It's a learning experience for us as much as it is for the kids.
So 2 quick questions based off of that. Well, the first is more just a comment, because I appreciate what you said that like it wouldn't suck for the kids. I also think the reality is it was probably better than whatever else we were doing before.
Agreed.
And so it doubly didn't suck for the kids because the project wasn't as bad as we feel like it was.
Right.
The kids had a better experience than we maybe feel. And it was probably a much more authentic, richer, deeper experience than what we would have been doing otherwise. Correct. So the kids really win on 2 levels.
Yes.
And we need to let go of some of that. But your reflection piece is really good advice. I didn't ask you to think about this, but since it came up, do you have a mechanism or a system? Because I struggle as a teacher going through those process and going, next year I need to blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. And then next year rolls around and I go, I know that there was something that I hated about this. And then I don't always remember. And so sometimes like do you have a system of how you help keep track of some of your reflection?
I do. I've gotten to a point where I do. So I actually was just talking to a couple first year teachers about this yesterday, believe it or not. And one of the things I asked them straight out, I said, do you use a digital calendar, or do you use paper, or do you, know, what do you use? And when everyone was, well, I use a planner. I said, okay. So when you're doing something, I said, take that paper copy that you're doing, put a sticky note in it and write the note that you saw on it, stick it in there. And she just kind of looked at me for a second. She says, well, I try to make notes on my lesson plans. I said, yeah, no, put it in your calendar, because when you go back and look at your calendar again, and you're looking at, oh, what was I doing? So I can kind of like look at my time scale. You're going to see that and you're going to go, oh yeah,
that's right.
And I said, that's really been helpful. And I said, that was something that I started doing when I was paper. And now that I've really almost completely digital, anytime that I'm working on a project, and I catch something, I will put a comment in or put a note right on the digital document. So, you know, even if it's a note to myself and make it as a to-do item and say, change this for, and I try to do it right away, just so that I remember. Or at the end of the project, I'll go through and I'll look at the kids' stuff that they've said, as well as what I've noted, and try to make notes on it. I don't necessarily always change it right away, but I will make comments on it, and then I will go through and either make a new copy of it and then make those changes, because I don't want to get rid of the iterations. Sometimes I want to keep those. Yes, revision history is awesome, and the fact that we have that, but sometimes I want to start clean.
You just want to start. I agree. Like I like using the revision history more for teamwork projects like this, to be able to show kids, no, you didn't do anything. Right. We can talk about that.
We'll talk about that later.
So I think those are great tips, however you're going to do it. And there were sometimes I was more successful at it than others. But I think as much as you can build that habit of some process of continually taking notes, I like adding the comments in the sidebar. There were some times where things were so glaring that I would go into the project document, like, you know, during the project, and make a new copy and start doing edits like right then, so that I didn't forget. But that's hard because of what we were just talking about. You're in the throes of this project and trying to keep your head above water. The idea of revising for next year,
it's not even
is not really feasible when you're trying to be ready for tomorrow.
No, realistically, you're not going to make those changes. I mean, if you can somehow note that those changes need to be made, that's the most important part.
Capture those ideas, capture that reflection
somehow. And I have a friend, a colleague that I used to work with, and she is notorious she prints out paper copies of calendars, and she like kind of tracks everything out on paper copy, which is fabulous. I don't do that as much, but she does. And it's really funny because she has a folder full of them. And so she'll actually pull them out for that year, and she can actually find notes that she left herself. And it's for her.
It's really powerful.
It's a really powerful tool. And for anybody who is a paper person, it works really well to do that. The digital, like on the digital calendar, and I do a digital calendar in addition to the stuff that I do on in documents and stuff. And so I will even make notes on those. So if I need to make a change, that I can always go back to it and reference it, so that I know that I need to make those changes. Whatever tool works, but I would say little notes here and there. And sometimes your notes will go, you'll come back and look at your note and go, I have no idea what I was trying to tell myself something, but I don't know what it was. So, I mean, that happens too, but you think, and then all of a sudden you get back towards it and you're like,
that's what
I meant.
Yeah, that has happened to me a lot. I'm glad that I'm not alone in that, but that's just part of the process.
Everyone goes through that process.
So certainly our goal today is to try to help teachers anticipate some of those things that are hard in managing a project. And how do we set in place a few systems that shift some of the burden of the project from us as the teacher onto the students as the learners responsible for, because that ultimately is the whole point of project-based learning. So some of these systems of managing that learning, there are some easy steps to take into that. And we don't need to talk a ton about this, but I want to point this out for teachers. You have this great resource about assessments and teams. And you said the purpose of this, it's for teachers.
Yes.
But if you scroll through this, and I know a lot of these resources are repeated, but what was so great in this were just these hard, fast, start with your standards, start with your 4 C's, here's an app map, here's your first day, what to do. Can you talk a little bit about this? Like, how do you set the stage and get the kids, because I would imagine if this is the first time you're doing this and you're really shifting, and you talked about this, even the kids being like, oh, we're really gonna, and being scared, this, you need their buy-in from the beginning. So how do you set that tone?
So actually,
day one?
If you leave that first day up the work there, we'll actually take a look at that, because that's actually one of the crucial pieces, is that front loading. So that, you know, so the last time you talked about front loading and doing all this work ahead of time and really having the project basically all laid out and trying to anticipate and everything.
Right.
So that's what that first day is really giving that launch opportunity. So you're really going to spend time with the kids going through and explaining, this is what we're doing. So that entry document is huge, because that's your hook.
Okay.
That's how you get the kids hooked into what you're doing. Well, you can do an entry doc any way you want to. It can be an activity that they're going to do. It could be a video. You could do a slideshow. You can do a letter. You can do a document. You can do whatever you want to.
Okay.
I've had speakers come in. I've had people go,
document.
It's anything you want it to be.
Kind of like the way I use text.
Yes.
When I talk about a text might be a picture or a video or a song. Anything. Like a text can be anything that you're okay.
So that entry event or entry document is huge, because that document or that event will become the part where the kids either at the end go, whoa, or they go, huh? And those
and we're hoping for the woes.
I actually am hoping for either, because if they're engaged, even if they're going, huh, that means that they're thinking.
Oh, that's a great point.
And so if they're not thinking, then they're just going to stare at you and never, pay attention to anything. But even as simple as, like, I've had teachers who will put just words on the board and the kids walk in and they go, what? And then from there, that stems into conversations. So that entry document is a hook. Pull them in, whatever it takes to pull them in, and then use that to then drive into the driving question. And the driving question focuses everything. So I'm sure Amy talked a little bit about the driving question. So that driving question is really, it's not the easiest thing in the world to write, but being able to get it so that it basically pushes the kids to where you want them to go at the end.
Right.
So being able to take that, and that's where you're going to introduce that. So that entry document is going to lead you right into that driving question. And then this is where the whole idea flips, is you don't go from there, okay, now let's talk about stuff. Instead, it says, here's what you're going to create.
So it goes right from, here's the question we're answering, and when you're done answering that question, this is what you have to have created in order to show that you know the answer to this question.
Correct.
Okay.
So that allows for the kids to see, this is what I'm going to have to do. And then that's where the overwhelm part comes into play.
I have to create an entire business plan.
So when you look at that final product, the kids kind of go, some of them will just kind of like gloss through it and go, what? And then the other ones will kind of go, really?
Right.
Really? And then that leads you into the idea of that first day of going, okay, sometimes like PBL Works doesn't always still do a need to know list. Need to know list is always something the kids are going to be thinking about, the things that they need to know. I still do that with the kids. I still go through and I say, what things about this do you know content wise? What do you know already? And what do you look at it and you're like, they're like, everything. I'm like, no, you got to give me specifics, because that's my favorite answer, everything. No,
I don't know anything about that.
That's awesome. So now go through, and so when I give them a rubric, which is what they'll have for that final product, is when they get that rubric, I actually tell them, go through and look at all the bullet points. And I say, take those bullet points and make them into questions. And then it forces them to go, oh, so I don't know this. I don't know this. So here's an example. This is a project that I've done with high school, and I've done a modified version with middle school. So this one is a Cell City project, and a lot of people will create something like it, where it's just taking the idea of cell, and instead of making a model of a cell, they make a city, and they have to make analogies. So therefore, they have to know what each part of the cell does, and they have to then be able to
think more creatively, apply that. So instead of just recognition,
then
they're really having to apply that
Yep.
knowledge. So you're
So-
pushing them up blooms as they're
Correct.
having to create their own understanding and their own
Correct.
analogy.
Yep.
Nice.
And so the analogy part is huge, is that they have to come up with how they're putting it together. So when they go through and they're looking at this,
If I'm going through this as the student and I go, cell parts,
I don't know what cell parts are.
like the
Right.
bars on the door of a jail cell,
Right.
like, right. So so if they looked through particularly the proficient column.
Right. And so as you can see, and most of my rubrics will do this, where I highlight out the
Mhm.
proficient column purposely. And that's a training method that I do with the kids too. And I will do that on day one, where anytime we're looking at a project, even if they've run projects with me before,
Mhm.
first thing I always say is, okay, so you're going to read through the rubric. And they go look at me like I'm crazy. And then I say to them, okay, so where do we start? Where do you always start reading? And they stop for a second. And when they first start, they'll say, well, we're going to look at advanced, or I'm going to look at 4. And I go, okay, well, go ahead and look at it. And they go, I said, what does the first line say? And they say, in addition to proficient. I said, okay,
so let's start there. Let's back up the cell. But
So-
that's a great tip, because as I'm scrolling through here, if I was a student, I would imagine, if I had to anticipate, like do my own anticipatory guide, I would imagine they may not know what analogous means.
Yep.
They may not know even city structures. Like they may need to review like just what are the parts of a city, like how does a city work? I would think that they would know like they might not know exactly what a blueprint is. They might have a vague understanding of that, of scale. Like what is scale as referred to? The city structure as analogous to, like we already said, the types of the cell, the functions of the cell parts, relate the cell parts. Like there would be a lot of things that I would be able to go through this. And this is a great tip, because if you just ask the students, what do you need to know? My concern in that question always is, well, they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
But
So-
your rubric,
it forces them to
shows
have
them.
Right. So they know what they have to know at the end. And so therefore it's asking them again to take that ownership piece and really say, okay, so some of this I already know. And some of them, they'll know bits and pieces of the content already, which is awesome.
Right.
Because then that lets me take them off the hook as far as, okay, so you already know this. I don't have to go through this with you.
Yeah.
When I'm working with this group of students, you're able to be working on something else.
Right. So now you can differentiate, like you can
Correct.
identify for those groups. So if one kid is like, oh yeah, I remember all of the parts of the cell from 7th grade biology.
Correct.
And you're doing this in high school biology, you can go, fantastic kid, move on to next. That's
Exactly.
great. So you can also help differentiate and pace.
Big time.
In order to do this.
Yep. So,
Okay.
so that looking at that final product and then forcing them to kind of, and it is a forcing them to stop and go, okay, so I have to look at that rubric. And if I look at that rubric, then I can take those individual pieces and figure out what do I know, what do I don't know. And the other part is I try to preface it with them when I talk about it, is that your know list is usually going to be a lot shorter than your need to know list.
And it should be.
Exactly. And so,
Yeah.
and they get really nervous about that. They're like, but I don't know anything. I'm like, that's okay. You shouldn't. If this is new
That's
stuff.
literally why you're in school.
Right. And that's the conversation I try to have with them, is if you knew it already, then I wouldn't.
Well, and
be
if we knew
teaching
it
you.
already, what would be the point of life?
Exactly.
If we
So-
want to get existential, right? Like what's the purpose? So then you go through, like, this is just nice. Okay, so you get them to create that list.
Yeah. So I have them create that list. And then the other part that I do is, one of the things always is working with other people and working in teams, that that's always the panic, right? The kids are always like, oh, who am I working with?
Yeah, I hated project group work.
And we'll talk about that group work too, because we'll get into
hated
the
it.
idea of teams versus groups.
Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit about that too. But with the idea of those teams, I always tell them up front right away who their teams are so that they know. And I do that the very first day. And I don't wait.
Take that.
I take it out so that it doesn't become an anxiety piece. And
do you create the teams? How much control do you, and it might be different from your
different all
high
the time.
school, middle school projects, but do you have a couple of different strategies or frameworks for how you
Put together
establish teams?
Yeah. So there's, depending on what it is. So, okay, so a great example is this business project that I'm working on with the kids right now. So I actually had them do an interest inventory, and then It's also an entrepreneur. There's some pieces of entrepreneurship characteristics that we threw into that as well. And so the purpose of that is to kind of get, okay, what kind of areas are you interested in? So that they would have something of a common ground. And then the other thing I did is some personality
for their
pieces.
business.
Correct. And then some personality pieces. So, you know, am I interested in creating something from scratch? And do I want to take something that already exists and make it better? Am I a technology person that I really want to do something in the tech field? So trying to take some of those personality pieces and being able to use that to try to build teams. And then also the other part of that is then taking the lovely moment of what my demographics are of my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got one class where I have a couple teams this year in this quarter that are just boys, because if I tried to balance it out, never take input, unless you know the people really well, I would never put one girl with multiple boys.
Oh, sure.
And that's something that I did not know when I first started doing project-based stuff, and it does come back to bite you a little bit.
Is the reverse true? Like, can
No.
one boy work
Yes.
with 4 girls?
Yes.
Interesting.
It's really bizarre, and it just has to do with dynamics, and it's a learned dynamic piece. So,
Okay.
and it's not something that you can't unteach, but it takes a lot
It takes
of work.
a while.
It takes a while. It takes work to unteach that.
Okay.
So that's an interesting thing that I've learned over the years, and that's something that I don't think I would have known right away. So I passed that on. I'm like, try, if you're going to do, like right now I do teams of 4 with this project. Team numbers change, but those teams of 4. So when I look at those teams of 4, I'm going to take an interest survey with this because I want to make sure it's something they want to work on. I am going to take into account if I've got kids that are going to need a little bit more support. And how I can work with those kids within teams. Other things I take into consideration, especially when I'm working with kids that are in wide ranges, and that's what this is, and it's a required course, so wide range of kids. I'm going to take a look to see if I have somebody who I know by looking at and talking to the other teachers, do I have somebody that's going to be a really strong leader that's going to be able to pull people together. If they're kids that I've been working with for like an entire year, then my groups will change, my teams will change, and sometimes I'll even let them pick their own. And we have cautionary tales when we do that. We talk about, have great conversations, especially with high school kids. Actually, middle school kids work with the same way. I tell them not to pick their friends. And I purposely say that. I said, unless you know that you can work with your friends, and it doesn't become a distraction, you shouldn't be working with your friends, because most of the time you're going to have a day where you're mad at your friends and then you can't work.
Yeah.
And I said, the other one is, don't ever be on the same team with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Breakups happen, and fights happen. I've had it happen in the middle of a project, and they broke up, and they still had to work together for 6 weeks. And I was like,
sitting side by side every single day.
Like, so just don't do these. These are life skill moments, and so we have life skill conversations.
And
so
as you're thinking about putting teams together, one other factor, in addition to every factor you just named, the other factor I think about is the work going to be done entirely in class?
Correct.
Or are there going to be expectations of these people potentially having to meet outside of school? And I would imagine that that's different at the middle school level. You can't really expect them to meet outside of school. But as seniors in high school, that was sometimes, because kids were in sports, so absences and different things can get complicated. So that was the only other factor that I would sometimes let influence who was working with who, was just that reality. So let's talk about managing. So there's a lot of other great information in this slide deck. Like, there's some other things of just like building a project wall, your documents, of just like things that you need to buy, your supplies. So there's a lot of nice concrete just to-dos to make yourself as prepared as possible so that the project itself is not as overwhelming as it might be. So that's this first set the PBL tone. And it really shouldn't be with your class. This is really about setting the tone for yourself.
Yeah. It's
more
really,
so that slide deck, at least.
It definitely sets the tone with your class, though, because of the fact that what it does is it gives you that background of what I need to be able to bring to my kids so that they have everything that they need. Because if you don't have what you need, and you haven't given it to them, that's when chaos occurs. And
to the point of this whole chat, if you don't have those things set up, you're not going to be able to nurture great groups. You're not going to be able to support the kids doing the learning process, because this is messy and scary for them as well as for us, the facilitators.
Absolutely.
So we need to try to stave off those things as much as possible. I do have links to 2 articles that I just thought were interesting. Edutopia has some recommendations on just some tips for groups, and I read through it and I went, I understand that as a student and as a teacher. And then I did really like this piece as well. This was just some advice. This is another teacher blog that I had not known about, but this is tips from students, and this connects to the final point, like before we jump into actually looking at these documents, of this student echoes what you just said. You call it teamwork, not group work. So as we're gonna get ready to talk about these general contracts, why is this a teamwork, not a group work situation?
Okay, so I really shifted. I used to call them groups, and I really shifted to the mentality of teams. And the reason being is that there's an interdependence when you start talking about a team, and the fact that every person on a team then has a role and has a job, and they do stuff for each other. Which, when you talk about a group, you can have a group of people, and a group of people doesn't mean that they all work together. It can mean they can hang out.
A group of people attend a basketball game.
Correct. So whereas if you're a team and you're on the basketball team, no matter what you're doing, you have a role. So even if you don't have the ball, you have a job.
Right.
And if you don't have the ball, you still have to do your job to be able to help make sure that you eventually get to score.
Yeah, but if I'm just part of the group watching and I leave to go get some popcorn, really no one cares.
Right. That's the point.
So yeah, that's just a nice, there's sometimes just those little shifts in the specificity of our language that can really have pretty big impacts on how the kids frame. Have you seen a difference? Like, does that help the kids think about it?
It does. And so when we talk about that, and I really am very precise in using the word team with the kids as well. And so they'll say, oh, is it a group project? And I said, well, you're working in teams. And they kind of stop and they look at me really funny. And my middle school kids right now are really interesting about that, because they'll say, we actually have talked about this. We said, okay, how many of you guys have been in a group project where one person kind of takes over and does everything? And they're like,
everyone.
I said, how many of you guys have been that person who's taken over and done everything? And, you know, a lot of hands go up. And I said, okay, here's one that's worse. How many of you guys have just kind of sat back and waited until that one person takes over? And the kids are like,
I'll be on.
Yeah. And they're like, they finally realize. And they're like, so I said, that's the reality. I said, if you're sitting in a group and you don't all have something you have to do, what ends up happening is that you're going to wait until someone kind of takes over and says, this is what I'm going to do. And the other part is that your voice isn't heard.
Yeah.
And I said, so that, you know, if you're a
team, your learning suffers because of that.
Correct. So you're not getting the end product. You're not getting what we want you to be able to know and be able to do at the end. Instead, what you're doing is writing off somebody else's coattails. So that leads directly into talking about these contracts, which is one of the pieces that I really believe in as far as groups. So we'll talk about the fact that people will create norms, which is totally normal as well. I actually go beyond norms and I really use contracts quite a bit.
Okay.
And these contracts, this is just kind of a template of like,
I really liked this one.
This is the minimum.
There are several that are here on this page. So there are several from PBL Works, formerly Buck Institute. It literally changed last Wednesday. So on last Tuesday, we were talking about Buck Institute when we were talking about project-based learning. And then overnight, they kind of rebranded. And so it's now PBL Works. Same content. But I really liked, as I looked at all of these contracts, there was something really elegant that I liked about this this is so simple, but it was so lovely. How did you evolve or get to this point for your group members?
So this one.
And this one, have you changed? Like, is this different? Does it change to team members?
It does.
Okay.
So this is an older version of it, but
Yeah.
this is essentially the same thing that I started working with kids, and what this is really after they've gone through training of being able to having used other templates and being able to see what contracts look like. You can go through and use this one as a sample and then edit this, edit that. So this is, and I give this to them ahead of time right away at the very beginning and say, this is what a contract is going to be eventually. You're just going to
include these elements.
Yeah. And so I say, this is what you have to have. And so then I'll give them this at the, like towards after they've had some experience with contracts and say, here you go, fill it out. And then I don't have to give them those
all the prescribed things.
Correct.
So first project,
it's a little bit more prescribed.
More prescribed.
Yep.
So this contract, like if this is your first project, and particularly if it's the kids' first project,
definitely
not a good thing.
No.
But if students, and I think it also is sequential, like there are some schools where kids start doing projects and then true project-based learning, and then go through project-based learning at multiple grades. So if that is true in your building, in your school, and you're the grade 5 teacher, you may be able to hand a group of kids this day 1, project 1, because they'll have all this prior experience.
Right.
So know that. But otherwise, there's PBL works.
I
have all these great, they have some kind of sample agreements.
Yep.
You know, you can add your own sample agreement. They have the consequences. Amy shared that she's talked to teachers where students can be voted out. If they break the contract, that could be one of the consequences, that they are then responsible for doing their own whole project.
Yeah. So in Amy and I, well, so since Amy was here, Amy got that from me because my contracts that I've worked with kids, so this is a fabulous one for, especially for elementary kids to be able to work through.
We promise to.
Yep. So, you know, kids don't necessarily believe. I always tell kids to make sure that you put in consequences for actions. And then part of that is I do tell them that they need to have a dismissal clause, that they do need to have written in what their dismissal policy is. One of them is that, you know, and one of the things I always tell them is that they do any work that that person has put in, they can take with them. They have to leave it, but they also can take with them. Okay. So anything that they've done, they have ownership of, but it's still part of the team too. So therefore it stays with the team. Okay. So that's hard for, you know, that's hard for middle school kids, but for high school kids, they get that a little bit better. The other part that I always tell them is that you can't kick somebody out the week before, like the week the project is due. That's just not doable.
It's too late.
Yeah.
That's disrespectful. So if there, and that's great reality of life, because if there's a problem and you're not addressing it,
that's on you.
Then well said. I mean, that's on you.
So we definitely create that dismissal piece of it so that they have that as an opportunity to be able to put that in there. The other thing, this is another example that I work with kids quite a bit. This is one I've used with my biology kids quite a bit in the high school setting. One of the things that I do, and they're like, well, why would I have a phone number on there? Why would you want to call me? I'm like, well, honestly, because if you have to contact people outside, and yes, we all have school emails, but sometimes we don't check our school emails. Sometimes we don't. So making sure that you know what's going to be the best. I added in the strengths and weaknesses part, and I like that because everyone's got strengths, everyone's got weaknesses. And then the other part is how will they compensate? So when you're looking at a weakness, how am I going to deal with the fact that I have a weakness? So if I say that I struggle with organization, so what will I do to help to balance that within my team? Because everybody has strengths, everybody has weaknesses. And whether that mean that I can look to somebody else on my team to help me with that weakness, that'd be fabulous.
Right, or to make sure that whatever I'm looking ahead down to your roles and responsibilities, that's not part of your roles and responsibilities. Correct. You're not the person who is going to be tracking deadlines.
Right.
That's going to be someone else.
So making sure that you take on a role that's going to be your forte, and definitely taking that into consideration. So you'll find out in teams that you'll have kids who don't do well in traditional school, but they'll do fabulous with this because they have that opportunity to shine in different areas that they wouldn't otherwise. So being able to have that contract set up so you have lots of opportunities. So those are the norms and
and this is from another teacher who was part of a social studies chat last fall. So these are all just different versions of, right, your contact information, responsibility, group norms,
And there's what happens.
like, right, yeah, like the first time a group member. So I did like that in this system, that the team must fire the student. So and there was part of me that I was like, ooh, that seems harsh. Then I thought about it. I think the difference there is, this is about, you might really like a kid. They might be your buddy.
But that doesn't mean that
doesn't mean they get a pass. And so this is about consistent accountability, but there is a 3-part system. Correct. It does not go straight to this person is fired. And then there's this tracking chart for any of those problems. So lots of different versions. So all of these, the only point of sharing everything from these super simple ones to the more complex is simply, and this is just the tip of the iceberg.
There's so many.
There's so many out there and so many things. But hopefully this gives people a place to start. And I think that this really, it goes back to that thing that you were saying of setting the tone on the first day. I think this really helps set the tone. At least for me, if I had been a student and I had seen, oh, like, we're gonna decide as a group what the consequences are if someone doesn't do their thing, I think my buy-in would have gone up tremendously as a kid who frequently was the, come on, you guys, like, let's, like, someone do something else. So I think that this really, it speaks to your whole tone point.
This piece of it makes a big difference, because if you don't have those parameters set, and it's the same thing as when you're working as an adult working with people, if you don't know what the expectations are, you're not going to be able to meet those expectations. And so that's the same thing here, teaching kids that they are setting those expectations for each other, and then being able to help them reach those expectations. So being able to fire somebody is really important. Being able to have that dismissal process is really important. My favorite thing ever was a kid who got dismissed from a group, and I always say it only happens once and it never happens again, because they realize how much work it is. These are not projects that are set up for one person. They're set up.
They're interdependent, collaborative.
So what I find is that if it happens once, it'll never happen again. And which is fabulous. Yeah. And my favorite I have this one kid in my head right now that I can still see his face, and he got fired and he was like, okay, yeah, whatever. And he threw something together. It was whatever. It was not very good. And then he comes to me after that and he goes, I'm never doing that again. And I go, okay, why? And he goes, that's so much work. I said, right. And
if he had done his portion of the work,
it wouldn't have been
that bad.
And the best part then is when conferences rolled around shortly thereafter, and when he actually came to conferences with his parents, and his mom looks at me and she goes, I just wanted to thank you. And I said, for what? And she goes, because he got fired. He always does nothing, and so he thinks he can just get away with it. He goes, it was the first time he's ever been held accountable. And I was like, score.
Yeah, well,
as a teacher, that's a huge win. And she got those.
I was going to say, that's really key too, that the parent understood that and was like, yeah, like those are your consequences. Yeah. And the student did still learn the content through the process.
Correct.
They probably didn't learn the depth, but they still did learn in terms of like but they also more importantly learned that bigger lesson of thinking collaboratively. Yep. One thought that I had on the contracts, because of something that you just said, made me think, oh, like it would also be interesting if you encourage students to think about how they like to be communicated with.
Yep.
Of, like for me, there was something about how you said, like, I do like things being very explicit and clear.
Yep.
So what are your expectations of me in this group? I frequently, like when I do group work, even now as an adult, I will say, I have a tendency to take things over, because I'm a teacher, I'm a theater director, and I'm just the kind of person who likes getting things done. So I'm sharing that as a weakness, back to the strengths and weaknesses, but also in terms of the compensation, in terms of how I'm going to compensate, I like that column, because for me, what I always tell people is, so if you're inviting me to be part of your project and you want my help, you need to tell me exactly what you want me to do and give me very specific parameters, because otherwise if things aren't happening, I'm just going to start doing stuff. And it's going to be really offensive to you. And I'm not trying to be, so like, this is that's a really great, and it took me a long time as an adult to go, oh, like, I'm not trying to be offensive or hurtful here, but man, I'm really irritating people.
Yep.
And so I recognize it is definitely a weakness of mine, but now I can just say, I know this is a weakness. So what I know I need in this group context for this to remain like a good thing, part of the compensation piece is I just need very specific tasks that are my responsibility. Otherwise, and in part because of all of these experiences, I'm going to go into different things.
Well, and that's part of it is that, and that leads directly into
it does.
It
goes,
right.
It's almost like all of these things are so, like, people are going to think that we scripted this whole conversation because things have like flowed along. We are literally just having a conversation of none of this was planned, of these examples, but it does go to that next thing. Yeah. So once you have those expectations,
then it allows you to go to that next step, which is being able to look at that planning guide and actually come up with that work guide. So and I know that I put this one on there, and this is a PBL Works one, and this is a super simplified, easy way to say, and this is what.
But it's so clear, like, this is what they need.
Right. And you want to talk about real world. This is real world project management, right?
It is.
It's exactly what it is. This is what we're working on. This is what needs to be done. This is going to do it. What does it have to be done by? And yep, it's done.
Right. And for me, I have it as a Google Keep. I have my tasks in my Google Keep, and I have the little things, and I have that running box, and I have like little notes, and I check things off as I go through. It's just a digital version of this.
Correct.
It is exactly the same kind of thing. So, and same as the group contracts, you can see there are, there are so many more.
Yeah, so there's individual ones, there's group ones, and the difference being that you're working with an individual. If you're doing something that you're in a team, but you're still saying, I'm going to do this individually, and this is what my job is, and this is how it pertains to what we're doing in our team. That's a fabulous thing, because you have to make that connection from, this is what I had to do, and this is how it actually helps my team. That's huge, especially when you're talking about that individual and that connection between team versus looking at what you're doing individually, and then also the idea of. And so it allows you to be able to really reflect as a learner and say, this is how I fit into the big scheme.
So these are great for reporting. Here's where my brain goes. Oh dear God, I have to grade every child's individual report and every group's team report?
Well, no. And again, we'll go into, so the one that's up there that is the Google form one, that's one that I basically took something very similar, and I said, you know what, I don't like the paper, first of all, and second, I don't have the time to go through and page through and read through every single one of them. Right. And not only that, I'm not going to grade that. That's more of a check, and for me to see, okay, are you where you need to be? And so this is putting
Right. So these papers are more for, this is about shifting the learning
to the kid. Yes.
So you might not sit down and scour each one of these reports.
No.
You're going to get
this one,
like a summary report.
And so what I will do is I will take, and I'll have kids do this digitally. And so this is kind of very similar to the same idea. I've kind of modified it a little bit, but talking about the same ideas. And so what I will do is I'll have the kids do this digitally. So then with Google Forms, and then also you can use whatever form, SurveyMonkey, you can use whatever you want to. And then you have it in a digital format that will show up as a spreadsheet, so that it's just right there for me, and I can look at it, and I can look at each kid, and I can have it all in one spot, so I don't have to scroll through all of it. The other part is my favorite, so like the last question, if you scroll on the last question, is questions, concerns, comments, things that they need or they need help with, they'll put in there. I'll go to that to help me plan for the next day.
Fantastic.
So that allows me to see what the issues are so that I can deal with those. Most of the things like the goals for today, the accomplishments, that's for them more than for me. The next steps really is for them as well. But those next steps also help me guide to see if there's something
instruction you need to do. So this is really about, it's part accountability on the part of the students. It's part reflection for the students. and it's that project management planning for you.
Yes.
So instead of having to read every single report, because I could also see, I like the fact that this is each individual child. You could, in theory, also do this one per team.
And I have done it that way too.
Yeah, it's just a different.
Yep.
And I could see even different stages of the project doing it differently. Of like today's reflection, everyone's doing a reflection.
Yep.
Like, right, and that maybe every day you get a team report, or every 2 days you get a team report, but once a week you get an individual or something. There would be lots of ways where you're not having to grade every single thing from every single kid every single day.
The other thing is for kids to keep track for themselves. Like I'll have them do an individual piece, and then what I'll do is I'll do a check-in with them. And so I'll do a check-in once a week. And so then I ask them to actually, I'll have either printed or I'll pull it up on my computer, and I say, okay, let's talk about your work. So let's talk about where you're at. And I make them basically look at it and summarize where they're at by using their stuff. And if they've only submitted 1 or 2 of them, and I'm like, okay, so why? And they'll go, and so it's a really great opportunity. I have a vehicle for conversation as well. So and
again, shifting that of like, this is your process. Like if you, and I love, it sounds at least like you're not scolding the kid, you're not punishing the child. It's just having that conversation of, right now, I don't have a lot of information. I can't help you.
Correct.
And it kind of feels like you might be behind schedule.
Yep. And so it really gives you as the teacher, as the facilitator in this regard, that you really have a better handle of where the kid is at by being able to just see and have that conversation. And then also because they're already working in a team or on their own, depending on what they're doing at the time, they're working so I can make my way around and talk to different kids. So I don't have to be standing and talking at all of them all at once. I can move from team to team to team because they all have expectations of what they're doing.
And that's one of the joys of projects. And you always hear that analogy as part of the shifting to project-based learning of, like going from that sage on the stage to the guide on the side. Correct. And it being about that coaching, and that you can spend, and I hear that a lot too with people who use flipped classroom.
Yes. Of
like, you get to do your sage on the stage in the flipped lessons.
Yep.
But then your time in class is really about coaching and guiding. And I see a lot of parallels in terms of managing that with the project-based learning. And I know I've heard young teachers, particularly I've heard them talking about like, man, like I really like doing project work, but there's so much grading. And I was trying to reflect back on my first few years teaching, and I was like, I think I know why. And then we had this kind of conversation that I was like, you don't have to look at every single word the kid writes. And I might have gotten there faster because as an English teacher, I'm very used to that.
Right.
When we're writing papers, I don't read every word every kid writes and every draft. No. I would never eat, sleep, or like do anything. And that was still kind of true as an English teacher, where I felt like I didn't do anything but read papers and read different things, but you can't possibly keep up.
No.
So it's finding that balance of what works for you. I would have check-in days, sometimes based off of those group to-do lists.
Yep.
I would sometimes have the groups give me a group timeline.
Yep.
And then they set their due dates.
Yep.
And so everyone had the same main project, like check-ins, but the team set their due date. And that also mixed it up. So it's a weird thing, but it was very rare that teams would pick the exact same due dates for things. Mm-hmm. So then instead of it being like one due date where I had to check in with everyone on that one day, I would just take the project teams and I would organize them by who had the first deadlines.
Yep.
And I would literally just put those sheets. This was a rare time where I liked paper copies. And I would put the first deadline for the first check-in up front, right? And then that would be the team I would check in on that day. And I would get a little bit more specific feedback of where they were at.
Yep.
And then their grade for that task went in the grade book.
Yep.
Even though other groups' grade for that same basic task or that check-in might not go in the grade book for another 2 or 3 days.
Right.
But it was an interesting way that the kids kind of differentiated for me.
Yeah.
when I was checking in with who, because they set their own deadlines.
Right. And that's awesome. Anytime that you can give, again, it gives the kids ownership, because if they don't think that they're going to be ready at this date, then don't set that date.
Right. Don't set that date. And we would have, back to your conversation with the kids about thinking through and being logical, we would have those conversations. So think through, are you in a sport? Are there significant tournaments coming up?
Yep.
As the theater teacher, I would always end up having 1 or 2 theater kids, right? So I would point that out. Like, so do you have like a major performance on a certain week that maybe
is
you
it going to
don't
be
also,
tech week?
right? Is it going to be tech week? And maybe you don't also want to have a major component of your assignment due that week, nor do you want it due the following Monday. Maybe your group needs to push their pace so it's done before all of that. Right. So we would have those conversations, but ultimately the decisions were theirs.
Yes.
And then it was very easy for me to hold them accountable for that.
Yep.
We do also have, I wanted to share this again, PBL is on everybody's minds. It's everywhere. I received these emails from Betsy from Spark Creativity, so another blog that I subscribe to. And this just happened to be what came in, and she has this thing of 1-pagers.
Yes.
And I was thinking, why not? I will be honest, I've never done this as a project reflection, but I was like, why not have a couple boxes and just let the kids, you can see that so these are 1-pagers where they're doing character analysis.
Yep.
But I was like, and she just has these super easy blank templates. That's all they are. Like, right. And they give them some basic, like these things. I was like, oh, I could see potentially using this as a reflection tool.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Or letting the students, again, depending on the project, depending on where kids were at, depending on those things, letting them design their own reflection feedback form. And if you can capture it in bullet points and some different things, why not?
That'd be a great check-in during a project for them to be able to take the key pieces that they have so far and put it into that framework. So
yeah, and
really
like
cool.
a visual kind of
Yep.
mind map of, and even going all the way back up to this lovely little illustration.
Yep.
Can they break down their project into some visuals like
Right.
this and have little to-do lists based on that? So just another, again, the whole purpose of all of this is thinking about the project and giving your kids enough of the tools so that they have, like, that you are helping them break down this large project.
Right.
Right. So that the eyes bugging out of the head slowly goes away because they have clear to-do lists.
Yep.
You have things to hold them accountable, but you can get through that. And then I did also want to share, I'll keep this brief. I was thinking of this as a great way to also do check-ins.
Oh, yeah.
I love this idea. I've never used this, but I adore Jennifer Gonzalez and Cult of Pedagogy. And I thought, this could be a very interesting thing. She was like, sometimes when we have rubrics that have everything on them for the whole project, kids can lose sight of what they
Yep.
just need to do. So she was like, what if you just had a single column that was like, here's a reminder of your criteria. And if they meet those criteria, fantastic. You just circle that criteria. If they did something that was above that, you give them marks above. If they aren't there yet, you give concerns. And I could see this even being a great peer feedback
Yes.
rubric to use. So not to take away all of the other, like the levels of proficiency from your rubric,
Yep.
take the, proficiency band, create a 1-column rubric. And when you're ready for doing some peer feedback, just simplify it to this.
Yep.
And that could be a step, and could even be a nice student self-check-in. Like, right, you're a week before due date. We're just gonna isolate the proficiency band and really focus on, so what are your concerns? What do you still need to work on? And if your goal is that advanced column,
What do you need to do to get there?
yeah.
Yeah.
So just something to think about as you're thinking about managing the projects and grading. And then rubrics are the joy of
I was gonna
rubrics.
say, love rubrics. They're my favorite.
I love rubrics. I will say I don't know that I have ever used the same exact rubric more than once.
I always end up
because
tweaking
I'm
them.
never happy with it, which is a good thing. I'm not satisfied. Like I want to do things. So same thing, PBL works.
They have so many awesome ones.
And so underneath this, the biggest change really, whereas everything just used to be open access, I did have to create an account.
Yes.
But it was free to create my account. So you can see I'm logged in. So that's the biggest difference with the PBL works, but it's free, and I was happy doing that. But you can see, you can just narrow the resources and you have these rubrics. I have provided a couple here that I just thought I'm having scrolling problems. That these were just interesting teamwork rubrics.
Yes.
Of if you're giving a teamwork grade or a collaboration grade.
So if you're working in those 21st century skills, they have some really great ones. And that's built into that idea of project-based learning, is really looking at those 21st century skills.
Yeah.
And then it's also the life skill piece of, my learning experiences. And so those collaboration pieces come into play as well. So they have some fabulous ones. In the metro area, so in the Fargo, Moorhead, and West Fargo area, we've actually created rubrics for 21st century skills. And so
all the metro schools have.
Correct. So those are the ones that it's the metro team that we created that, oh God.
I was still at West Fargo. I was going to say it was several years ago.
It was about 7 years ago when we first implemented. Wow. That makes me feel old. When we first created those, so I got to be part of that process of creating some of those as well.
That's a good reminder. I forgot about those. So those aren't on the video, but when you access this slide deck, I will add those.
Yeah, that'd be fabulous.
Fargo, Moorhead, 4Cs, the 21st century skills rubrics here, because that's another just framework for it, and they capture all the goals of project-based learning of what you want to do. So we have stretched our time a bit. We'll maybe do like the extended, like the behind the scenes, like extended thing. I feel like I have many new ideas that if I was tackling another project or project-based learning, honestly, I think a lot of the things that we've talked about would also work if you're facilitating a project in your classroom and would be very helpful. So whether you're doing a true project-based learning experience or you're doing an end of a unit project, so many of these things I think would really make the whole process go so much better. I do want to point out in terms of project ideas, there are several different project ideas down here. Do you have a favorite? Like, because I was so excited to read all your rubrics. We've talked about the City Cell project and that rubric. Yep. Do you have one of these other ones? And I didn't even put all of the projects on here that you had in your rubrics, but is there another one that you just want to share, kind of like the process and like the guiding question that helped set that up?
Well, I don't know if I have the driving question off the top of my head, but the DNA to protein one is kind of a cool one. And this is there's a couple of sample kids on there, but this one is kind of a cool project just because it is, can you design an animation or a learning tool to help biology students learn DNA replication and protein synthesis? So it was really making the kids come up with a way to be able to teach other kids about the process, which means that's, and that's always the key, is teaching others is the best way to learn something.
Right.
And so they really had to be able to own the content. And so they were given a sequence, and they had to take that sequence and they had to roll that sequence from the smallest to the biggest. And so that was actually a really, really cool project. And the part that's fabulous about it is that you get some really good ones and you get some not so good ones.
And I don't know if these are good ones of your project samples, but I really liked how these kids visually did this, and they did it in PowerPoint. They could certainly, there are stop motion apps that they could use now, but I really liked how it is clear that this is a step-by-step of how all of this breaks down. And I could imagine the explanation going along with these visuals of how they were going through this. But I started scrolling through this. This is 124 slides
I
long.
took so many pictures. And that was the cool part, is to watch everybody do things differently. And that's the part I love about it, is that it really forces them to be able to take on what they want to do with it. And I wish there had another one at some point. I don't know where it is. They did it in PowerPoint, but they had 3 slides and everything was slide in, slide out, slide here, slide there. And I'm like, holy crap, I can't do that. How did you do that? It was fabulous. And so it was great to give them the ability to just
create something. Yeah. And it's really cool. Things like PowerPoint and Google Slides are much more powerful than I think a lot of us use them for the simple, but there's so many cool things that they can do.
So I would say that's actually one of my favorites. I love that one. And then, oh God, what's another one that I love? So right now I'm really digging the business project.
And that sounds great. Yeah. And so many layers of them creating.
So we worked with a business partner last quarter, and the kids got to go to Sanford, and then they presented in a boardroom at Sanford, which made it even more authentic. And so they got a tour at Sanford, so they actually got some of those connections between job opportunities that aren't just being a doctor and a nurse, which was awesome. And being career in tech, education, that's a huge piece, is being able to talk about those career opportunities. You know, being able to get into that building and seeing all the cool things in that building. So, you know, anytime that we can make those connections. And so right now I'm really digging that, because first quarter I had people come in from the Fargo-Moorhead business community, wide ranges from the president of downtown Fargo to person at the trade commission for the state level, you know, cool people who just came in who were wanting to hear kids talk about business plans.
And I love that you're like, that is a perfect segue to not next week, but the following week. We're going to have a whole conversation, and you're welcome to join us back if you're free. We're going to have a whole conversation about how do we add that authenticity aspect of a great project. And I think you can do, like, I think the authentic learning is there in a good project.
Absolutely.
But the things that you're talking about, take that authentic learning and add in this authentic life experience that just take it up to an even next level.
Ramp it up.
And so hopefully today, I mean, certainly the purpose of today was to break down and just go through some of these logistics. How do we make a project so that we are holding kids accountable, so that we are, I hate that this is a reality of teaching, but honestly, so that we're putting things in the grade book so that parents like see that their kid has a grade, right? I mean, there are just those constraints that we have to do that. We need to. And I would argue that in general, in a grading process, and I would love to hear, I do want to hear this from you. I would say in general, when I would do a project, the process was worth about the same number of points as the product.
Yes.
So if the students were working on 100-point project, there were about 75 to 100 points of check-ins and different things for the process of like assessing the team and like a separate grade for that. But all of those small grades added up were close to, it was rare that they were exactly the same, but they were close to the same amount as that. And that's, I'm a high school, so that was like but that was intentional on my part. How do you balance that?
Well, one of the things that I try to do to help balance the whole process and the individual and the team part of it. So one of the things is that I always have an individual product in addition to a team product. And so the individual product usually is part of that process along the way, which is the individual pieces to get to the end product. This one,
I noticed that in this rubric. There are some things that are labeled group.
This one might be, it says group, and then the other things will say individual. And then there'll be individual skill pieces with 21st century responsibility. So that individual part of it becomes a huge piece, because the team still needs it, but it's always going to be a piece that is only that individual.
Great. And that also helps. I didn't say that. I agree with that completely. And that frequently also helps students when I articulate, you will be graded as an individual
Correct.
for your component of this project.
Correct.
So even if they didn't get to the point where you fired them, but they still didn't do a great job on their individual component, the group doesn't wholly suffer from that. There's that individual accountability of what is responsible. So that's a great layering in of like, how do we grade that? And again, it connects back to managing good groups of the kids. The kids are more at ease when they know that.
When kids know that they are being assessed on what they're doing rather than what they're doing, then they feel much more at ease. The other part of that is that, yes, the process piece, that's all those individual things that you would do anyway, whether it be a homework assignment, whether it be a check-in, whether it be a quiz, whether you still do those things.
True.
And those
you might still do a vocabulary quiz on the content that you're covering through this project.
Correct. Yeah. So those pieces are part of that process grade. So that's the parts that I always go, oh yeah, they always balance out. It's just like when I would do old school traditional teaching where you look at it and go, all the stuff that I did and the test, oh, they always balance out. They're about the same. And try to keep them in. We, as teachers, we do that without thinking after a while. It takes a while to get to that point, but after a while you realize you get to the point where you go, okay, so if someone doesn't do their homework very well and they
is
do
a rock star on the test or the project,
that'll help balance it out. And we don't,
and vice versa.
Right, exactly. And so if we don't necessarily think about it, after a while we start to just kind of do it naturally because it's and I think there's some teachers who don't, but most teachers kind of see it as, you kind of find that, oh, well, we want to make sure they get the opportunity to be able to show what they can do in their format.
Well said. Yep. And just find that little bit of balance. You're right. Like, I don't know that I don't sit down and I'm like, well, I need to have this many things. You're right. It just kind of happens.
Yeah, it's an evolution.
And it's an evolution. And I always tell my students, I'm pretty blunt at the high school level, where I will say, it won't be super hard to get a C in this class.
Yeah.
If you do what I'm asking you to do,
you'll be just
and
fine.
You participate. If you're not a great test taker, if you're not great at writing papers, you'll still be fine.
Yep.
Right? So you could get a D on every essay you write in this class, and you would still get a much better grade than that because of all the other things. And I think that's a nice balancing. And I say that having just said you don't need to grade everything. And it's not about grading every single word for me. It's about having that conversation with the student and having that quick check. There are days where my quick check for a task is them entering the classroom and me saying, tell me X. And it's a 1-sentence feedback where I'm standing by the door and then I'm just literally putting a check mark that they told me that sentence, they've given me a clear thing, and then they go in and they get a 5-point, like they told me what they needed to tell me for the day. So some of my check-ins are very brief and simple.
Well, keeping it to the same idea and I guess that's why I always talk about project-based learning being that vehicle, because it's that framework that you're using, because you're still going to do all your formative assessment pieces that you would do anyway within the classroom. And, it just looks a little bit different because they're sitting together and four people working on something. So instead of, my sea of how many kids, instead I have pods of these kids. And then I'm going and talking to individuals rather than talking to the whole class.
Yeah.
So it works the same way.
It all works the same way and it balances out. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here.
Absolutely.
I always say this, but now I'm like so excited of like doing a project, and I hope to hear more stories. I would love to get, even if it's just a few pictures, I would love to see these businesses that your students are creating and hearing about that experience. So hopefully, as always, the whole purpose is that this is helpful for you in your classroom. So if you have other tips, things that you do to manage these projects, please share that in the comments of the video. Share that so that other teachers can learn from your experiences as well. But thanks so much for coming in and sharing your PBL expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time on our weekly web chat.